Hi, so today we're going to talk about some of the main components of the circulatory system, otherwise known as the cardiovascular system. I'll mostly use those terms pretty interchangeably. But as we go through today's video, I want you to have a paper and pencil handy because there are some embedded questions that you're going to want to answer as we go along. Okay? All right, so the cardiovascular system is really a way to transport a variety of things throughout our body. So there's three main components. There's a heart, which is the pump. This is how you actually forces the blood throughout the body. The blood is the medium that carries the nutrients, gases, and waste. And then blood vessels are what the blood basically goes through to get to every part of the body. All right, and this is just showing some of the various things that the cardiovascular system actually transports and exchanges. So we've talked about this when we talked about the respiratory system. So the blood is responsible for picking up oxygen from the lungs and then carrying it to all the tissues in your body. And at the same time, it picks up carbon dioxide and then releases the carbon dioxide back to the lungs so you can breathe it out. All right, so that's obviously one of the main purposes, but it also picks up things from the digestive system. So let's say you eat a big meal, right? You break that down into various amino acids and sugars and various nutrients, and then those nutrients are now picked up by the cardiovascular system so that they can be delivered to whatever cells happen to need, let's say glucose, or it might be transported to the liver for more processing. Okay. Similarly, we have waste that are generated from various systems. Your tissues are getting rid of things they don't need, and the urinary system is one way that we can remove things from the body. So again, the urinary system and the blood are interacting to help transport those waste. All right, and here is question number 1. Were you listening? All right. So the blood itself is made up of a variety of different things. So if you were to take a blood sample and spin it in a centrifuge, so basically anything that's heavy is going to come to the bottom of this tube, you'll see that it splits into two main components. So the plasma is basically the liquid portion of the blood. So it's mostly water. You can see it's 92%. And then there are various other proteins and things that are dissolved within this plasma. So remember we talked about antibodies when we talked about the immune system. So antibodies are an example of a protein that's transported in the blood. All right, the other 45% of the blood are the formed elements. And these are the red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Okay, and you can see sort of the pictures of those down here. So what do each of those things do? So if we look at red blood cells, sometimes you'll hear the word erythrocytes. Basically, the job of red blood cells is to transport oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. So the way it transports oxygen is because each red blood cell contains this protein called hemoglobin. And hemoglobin has iron in it, and that iron can bind to oxygen. So the hemoglobin is the protein in red blood cells that binds oxygen. And that way, the blood can transport large amounts of oxygen to the tissues in your body so that when a tissue needs to break down glucose using cellular respiration, there's oxygen that's present. Okay? One thing that's a little strange is red blood cells, even though we call them red blood cells, are not actually cells anymore. So they originated from cells, but mature red blood cells actually lack nucleus or other organelles, so they're pretty much just a bag of hemoglobin at this point. Their only role is to really transport oxygen. So they have a limited lifespan of about 120 days, and that means that your body is continually making new red blood cells to replace these old red blood cells when they die and are taken out of the system. All right, white blood cells are also called leukocytes, and these again are part of our immune system, if you'll remember. And these are found in the blood, but also in various body tissues. So we talked about the lymphatic system, things like tonsils and lymph nodes have a lot of leukocytes, and they're also actually found like within the tissues themselves. So they play a role in the immune defense. These are real cells, so they're nucleated, and they can exit blood vessels by squeezing between the cells of the vessel walls. So that's how they get from the blood to the area that there's an infection or an injury or something that they need to deal with. All right, and one of the ways they do this is some white blood cells can engulf pathogens and cell debris. So remember this term phagocytosis. So they just kind of surround it and engulf it. All right, and the third part of those formed elements are the platelets. And these also are not real cells. These are just cell fragments. And basically they contain a lot of enzymes, and these play a role in blood clotting. So if you ever injure yourself, and you hold it tight until it clots, the platelets are partially responsible for forming that blood clot. There are also other proteins in the blood itself, that there's a whole cascade of things that happen to make that blood clot form, but platelets are an integral part of that process. All right, here's question number 2. Okay, so we talked about the blood now. So now let's talk about what the blood travels through, the blood vessels. So there's 3 main types. So there are arteries. So these carry blood away from the heart. So think the 2 A's, arteries and away. They can start out really big as they are leaving the heart. There's a lot of blood coming through them and it's under high pressure. And then they're going to branch into smaller and smaller units that are called arterioles. Okay, so those are the arteries taking blood away from the heart. Veins carry blood back to the heart. Okay, and these are thinner than arteries because think of it. You've had the blood going through all the arteries into the tissues and then being collected by the veins. So it's now a low pressure system. So these can be thinner walled. And one of the problems with veins is you don't want the blood to go back in the wrong direction. So there are a variety of one-way valves that help prevent that backflow. And just like smaller arteries are called arterioles, smaller veins are called venules. Okay? And then in between the arteries and the veins are capillaries. And this is really where any exchange between the blood and the tissues is going to happen in these thin-walled capillaries, where the blood, like red blood cells, really are going almost single file through these capillaries. Okay, so if we think about that overall pattern, right, you have an artery, and so here's a big artery. Let's say it's leaving the heart. It's going to branch into smaller arteries and smaller arteries until you hit the capillaries. In the capillaries, it's going to dump off its oxygen. So notice we have this color change from red to purple to blue. So that's indicating oxygen levels. So it gets rid of oxygen and any other nutrients that those tissues might need, picks up any waste products, and then those small capillaries are going to form bigger and bigger venules, and those venules come together to form larger veins until you form the larger veins that then go back to the heart. So notice arteries that come from the heart to the tissues are going to carry oxygen, so they're oxygenated. And then once it's dropped off its oxygen in the tissues, the veins are mostly carrying deoxygenated blood back to the heart. Okay, question number 3. All right, and the heart itself, I just want to say a few things about. You learned about this when you were doing your reading on CK12, but remember this is the pump, so it's actually a big muscle. And that muscle is formed from what we call cardiac muscle cells. So cardiac is basically another word for heart. It has 4 chambers, and it has 4 chambers because it's basically a double pump system. And I'll talk about that in a minute. And the reason that this can pump is that cardiac muscle cells contract, okay? And they actually, all the cells in the heart are contracting together in a rhythm that makes the heart then an efficient pump. If these cells get out of rhythm, then it interferes with how efficiently that pump can work. All right. And what controls that ultimate rhythm are pacemaker cells. So you may have heard of pacemaker cells. All right. So the circulation of the blood, remember, it's a double pump. So the pulmonary circulation goes between the heart and the lung. So pulmonary is another word for lung. The systemic circulation moves between the heart and the rest of the body. All right, so our four muscular chambers, we have a right atrium and right ventricle, left atrium and left ventricle. Okay, so the ventricles are the bigger pumps because they're really what's going to pump the blood out of the heart. Okay, so here's again our little diagram. So notice the color coding. So you have blood that returns to the heart through veins, right? It comes in through the right atrium. So notice this is not what you would expect because, again, it's the person's heart. So you'd have to kind of flip yourself. So this is the right side, atrium to ventricle. Then the pulmonary circulation pumps it out to the lungs because it has to pick up oxygen, picks up oxygen, goes back to the heart, goes through the left atrium into the left ventricle, and then the left ventricle pumps it out to the body's tissues. All right, so notice the one artery, this pulmonary artery, actually has deoxygenated blood because it hasn't picked it up from the lungs yet. All right, and here's the diagram of the heart. You're going to practice some of this labeling when you get done watching the video. So you might want to pause it right now and just think about what the different labels are indicating. All right, question 4 and 5. All right, and then as the veins, remember, have one-way valves, your heart actually also needs to prevent blood from backtracking through the heart. So there are valves between the ventricles and the atria, and there are one-way valves between the ventricle and the arteries. So this is what's actually making that lub-dub sound like you think of from a heartbeat. It's the valves closing off as the heart's beating. And if those valves become damaged, right, you hear a little bit of a back murmur as blood leaks through those valves, and that's what's called a heart murmur. And some are really relatively innocuous. They don't cause any damage, and people have them and don't even know. And then this can become more problematic until the point where people actually might have to get their valves replaced. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. All right. And then one thing to think about is all I've been talking about is blood being pumped through the heart. But remember, the heart's a muscle, so you need to actually deliver oxygen to the heart itself. And the blood going through those four chambers doesn't do that. So you actually need a blood supply to the heart. So you have these coronary arteries that actually branch off the aorta, and they deliver oxygenated blood to the muscle itself. Okay, and these are the arteries that are going to become important when we talk about heart attacks. So the heart, as I just said, has its own blood supply, and when that blood supply becomes reduced or blocked, that can trigger a heart attack. All right, so again, if we look at this artery, if there's a blockage, let's say here, that prevents oxygenated blood from getting to this tissue, then those cells might become injured and die. And then if they're not beating properly, that's what can cause a heart attack. All right, and this can be caused by plaques in those coronary arteries. So high cholesterol levels, for instance, can lead to those plaque formations. And that sort of idea that the cells receive insufficient oxygen is called a myocardial infarction. Okay, and our last bit, we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but I wanted to bring it back to homeostasis. So one of the things blood vessels do is by directing how big the blood vessels get and how much blood goes through them, they can actually distribute heat. So what happens when you go running and you get really hot? So you may get like really red-faced. That's because those blood vessels near the surface are opening up to help cool you off. And then the opposite would happen when you're cold to keep the blood more in your core. Okay, I think that's it for today. Here's our last couple questions. All right, so 8 through 10, have a good